What if I told you the hardest part of being a mother isn't raising your children? It's realizing one day they no longer need you. And worse, they don't even remember you the way you remember them because my name is Margaret. And I'm 79 years old, and this house, this quiet, echoing house, used to be full of laughter, of running footsteps, of voices calling mom from every corner. But now it's just me, the ticking clock. And memories that don't know when to leave. And maybe you've felt that kind of silence before, the kind that isn't peaceful, it's heavy, like it's trying to remind you of everything that's missing. And I sit here some mornings with my cup of tea going cold in my hands, staring at the empty chair across from me, remembering a time when I never had a moment to sit down, when life didn't slow down enough for silence to exist. Because I raised three children alone, and when I say alone, I don't mean their father passed away or left quietly. No, he disappeared in a way that leaves more questions than answers. One day he was there, the next day gone, leaving me with three little faces looking up at me like I had all the answers, like I was strong enough to be both mother and father, protector and provider, and I didn't have time to break. I didn't have time to ask, why me? I just got up the next morning and kept going because that's what mothers do, right? They don't stop, they don't fall apart, they just keep moving, even when their world has already shattered. And I worked jobs, more than I can count, cleaning houses in the morning, working at a diner in the afternoon, sewing clothes late into the night while my eyes struggled to stay open. And I remember nights where I would fall asleep sitting up, needle still in my hand, only to wake up a few hours later to start all over again. Because there were mouths to feed, school supplies to buy, dreams to protect, and I made sure they never felt the weight I was carrying. I made sure they never went to bed hungry, never missed a school trip, never felt like they were missing something. Because in my mind, if I gave them everything, if I sacrificed enough, one day it would all come back to me in love, in respect, in the simple comfort of knowing I wasn't alone anymore. And maybe that's where I was wrong. Because children don't always remember the nights you stayed awake worrying. They don't always see the cracks behind your smile. They grow up, they build their own lives. And slowly, without you even noticing, you become less important in their world. And I didn't realize when that shift happened. I didn't see the exact moment when their mom turned into just someone they called once in a while. When visits became shorter, when conversations became distant, when excuses replaced effort. And at first, I told myself it was normal, that they were busy, that life gets in the way, that this is just how things are supposed to be. But deep down, there was a feeling I couldn't ignore, a quiet voice asking me, when did you stop being part of their life? And I pushed that thought away every time it came, because what kind of mother thinks like that? What kind of mother questions her own children's love? So I kept believing, I kept waiting, I kept telling myself that things would go back to how they used to be, that one day they would walk through that door, sit at this table, laugh the way they used to. And for a while, I lived on that hope. Because sometimes hope is the only thing that keeps you going when reality starts to hurt. And if you're listening to me right now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever given everything to someone, only to feel like it was never enough? Because that's a question I didn't allow myself to answer for a long time, not until the day everything changed, not until the day I realized that the distance I had been ignoring wasn't just distance anymore. It was something else entirely. Something I wasn't ready to face, and if I had known what was coming, if I had known how things would turn out, maybe I would have prepared myself, maybe I would have protected my heart a little more, but I didn't. Because I believed in something simple, that love given honestly would always come back, and that belief is what made what happened next hurt even more. Because the truth is, I didn't just lose my children slowly over time. I lost them in a moment I will never forget. A moment that started like any other ordinary day, but ended in a way I never saw coming, and what they did next is something no mother ever expects. What if I told you the strongest people you know aren't strong because life was easy, they're strong because they never had a choice, and that was my life for years, not something I picked. Not something I prepared for, but something I stepped into the moment their father walked out and never came back. Because when you have three children standing in front of you, too young to understand what's happening, but old enough to feel that something is wrong, you don't get the luxury of breaking down. You don't get to sit in your pain and ask why. You get up, you wipe your tears before they see them. And you become everything they need, even if you don't know how, and maybe you've been there too, in that moment where life changes overnight and suddenly you're expected to carry more than you ever thought you could. And I remember those early days like they happened yesterday, the way the house felt different, quieter but heavier, like something important had been taken out of it, and I had to fill that emptiness without letting them feel it. So I created routines, I created structure. I made sure mornings were filled with rushed breakfasts and laughter, even if it was forced. Because I knew if I slowed down, even for a second, the truth of our situation would catch up to all of us, and I couldn't let that happen, not to them, not when they still believed the world was safe, and so I worked. Harder than I ever had before, jobs that most people wouldn't even consider doing long term, but for me they weren't options. They were necessities, cleaning houses where people barely looked at me. Standing on my feet for hours at the diner serving food to strangers while wondering if my own children had eaten enough that day, and then coming home late at night, exhausted, only to sit down and help with homework. Listen to their stories, pretend like I wasn't barely holding myself together, because they didn't need to see my struggle, they needed to see stability, and I became that for them. Even when it meant losing pieces of myself along the way, and there were nights, so many nights, where I would sit alone after they had gone to sleep, staring at the bills on the table, doing the same math over and over again, hoping the numbers would somehow change, hoping I could stretch what I had just a little further, and when it didn't, I found another way. I always did, because failure wasn't an option. Not when 3 lives depended on me, and I remember one winter in particular, when things got so tight that I had to choose between heating the house properly or making sure they had everything they needed for school, and I chose them. Of course I did. I layered them in warm clothes, made sure they never felt the cold the way I did, sitting up at night wrapped in a thin blanket, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself it would all be worth it one day. And that's the thing about sacrifice. You don't question it when you're in the middle of it. You don't keep track of what you're giving up because you believe there's a future where it all makes sense, where all the sleepless nights, all the missed opportunities, all the quiet pain comes back to you in the form of love, in the form of appreciation, in the form of knowing that you mattered. And I held onto that belief tightly. Because it gave meaning to everything I was going through, it made the struggle feel purposeful. And as the years passed, I watched them grow, watched them become their own people, strong, capable, independent, and I was proud. More proud than words can explain, because I knew what it had taken to get them there. I knew every sacrifice behind their success, every moment I chose them over myself, every decision I made with their future in mind. And when they graduated, when they started building their own lives, I stood there quietly, smiling, telling myself, this is it, this is what it was all for, because in my heart, I believed something simple, that the love I gave would come back to me, that the years I spent putting them first would mean something, that one day, when things slowed down, when life settled, we would sit together again. Not because they needed me, but because they wanted to, and maybe that's the part that hurts the most, not the sacrifices themselves, but the expectations we build around them, the quiet hope that one day, someone will look at you and say, I remember everything you did for me. And for a long time, I held on to that hope. I lived in it. I trusted it because it was the only thing that made all those years feel complete. But what I didn't realize, what I refused to see, was that while I was holding on to the past, believing it still mattered, their world had already moved on, and the signs were there, small at first, easy to ignore, a missed call here, a canceled visit there, conversations that felt shorter, less meaningful, like something had changed but no one was talking about it. And I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking. That this is just how life works when children grow up, but deep down there was a feeling I couldn't shake, a quiet, uncomfortable truth that I kept pushing away, because accepting it would mean facing something I wasn't ready for. Something that would force me to question everything I believed about love, about family, about the years I gave without hesitation, and if you've ever felt that shift. That slow distance that doesn't happen all at once but builds over time until one day you realize things aren't the same anymore, then you know exactly what I mean. Because the hardest part isn't when they leave physically, it's when they start leaving emotionally, when you can feel them pulling away but you don't know how to stop it, and I didn't stop it. Maybe I couldn't. Maybe I didn't want to see it clearly enough to try, but either way, I let it happen, and I kept telling myself everything was fine, until the day I realized it wasn't just distance anymore, it was something much deeper. Something that would change everything I thought I knew about my own children, and what they did next made me question if all those years of sacrifice ever meant anything at all. What if I told you the scariest part of losing people isn't the day they walk away? It's the slow, quiet realization that they already have long before you accept it, because looking back now, the signs were always there. Just small enough for me to ignore, just subtle enough for me to explain away, And maybe you've done that too, convinced yourself that something isn't wrong when deep down you know it is, because accepting it would hurt too much. And I remember the first time I truly felt it, not just noticed it, but felt it, that shift that you can't quite describe, but you can't ignore either. It was a simple Sunday, the kind that used to be ours. The kind where the house would be full, where laughter would echo through the rooms, where I would cook more food than necessary just because I loved watching them eat, loved seeing them together. But that day, the house was quiet. And I told myself it was fine, that they were busy, that adults have responsibilities, that life doesn't always allow for family time the way it used to. But then one of them called, and instead of hearing excitement, instead of hearing warmth, I heard distance, and it wasn't in the words, it was in the tone, in the way the conversation felt rushed, like I was something to check off a list rather than someone they wanted to talk to. And I remember holding the phone after the call ended, staring at it for a few seconds longer than I should have, trying to understand why something so small felt so heavy. And that's when it started, not a big moment. Not something dramatic, just a quiet awareness that something had changed. And once you notice that, you start seeing it everywhere, in the missed calls that aren't returned, in the visits that get shorter and less frequent, in the way conversations lose depth, lose meaning, until they feel more like obligations than connections. And I kept telling myself it was normal, that this is what happens when children grow up, that independence means distance. But there's a difference between growing up and growing away, and I didn't want to admit that difference, because admitting it would mean accepting something I wasn't ready for. And so I held on to excuses, I created reasons for them. I protected them in my own mind, even when they were slowly disappearing from my life. And maybe that's what mothers do. Maybe we defend our children even when it hurts us, because it's easier than facing the truth. And I remember one moment that should have made everything clear, one moment that I replayed in my mind over and over again afterward, wondering how I missed what it really meant. It was my birthday, nothing big. Nothing special, just a day that used to mean something, a day when they would show up, when the house would feel alive again. But that year, it was quiet, no knocks on the door, no surprise visits, just a few messages that felt empty, like they were written out of habit rather than love. And I sat there, looking at my phone, rereading those messages, trying to find meaning in them that wasn't there, trying to convince myself that it was enough, that this is just how things are now. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the same. I knew something was missing, and that missing piece wasn't time, it was effort. And effort is something you can't ignore once you start paying attention, because it shows you exactly where you stand in someone's life. And I started to see it more clearly after that, the way plans would change at the last minute, the way promises became uncertain, the way I was always the one reaching out, always the one trying to hold on to something that felt like it was slipping away no matter how tightly I held it. And I remember one conversation in particular, one that stayed with me longer than any other, because it wasn't what was said. It was how it was said, the tone, the lack of warmth, the subtle impatience, like I was asking for too much just by wanting to talk. And that's when the question started forming in my mind, slowly at first, almost quietly. Like it didn't want to be heard, am I becoming a burden? And that question, it's one of the hardest things a parent can face, because you spend your whole life making sure your children never feel like a burden. And then one day you start to feel like one to them, and I tried to push it away. I tried to ignore it. But once a thought like that enters your mind, it doesn't leave, it lingers, it grows, it changes the way you see everything. And suddenly every interaction feels different. Every silence feels louder. Every absence feels heavier. And I found myself sitting alone more often, thinking about things I never used to question, wondering when exactly everything changed, wondering if there was something I did, something I missed, something I could have done differently, because that's what we do, isn't it? We look for reasons, we blame ourselves, because it's easier than accepting that sometimes people just change. Sometimes they move on in ways we didn't expect, and we're left behind trying to understand why. And I kept holding onto the past, onto the memories of who they used to be, onto the belief that somewhere underneath all of this, they were still the same children who needed me, who loved me, who would come back if I just waited long enough. But what I didn't realize, what I refused to see, was that waiting wasn't bringing them closer. It was only making the distance more real. And by the time I finally understood that, by the time I finally saw things clearly, it was already too late, because what happened next wasn't just distance anymore, it was a decision, one that would change everything. One that would make me realize that I wasn't just being forgotten, I was being left behind. What if I told you the moment that breaks you isn't always loud? Sometimes it's quiet, polite, almost normal on the surface, but underneath it carries a truth so heavy it changes everything. Because the day it all became real didn't start with an argument. It didn't start with anger, it started with a simple call. And I remember that call so clearly because nothing about it felt urgent. Nothing about it warned me that my life was about to shift in a way I wasn't prepared for, and maybe you've had moments like that too, where something ordinary turns into something unforgettable without any warning. And when I answered, it was my oldest, his voice calm, controlled, almost too controlled, like he had practiced what he was about to say, and that alone should have told me something was different, but I didn't question it, not yet. Because you don't expect something like that from your own child, you don't prepare yourself for the idea that a normal conversation could carry something that would stay with you forever. And he said, "Mom, we need to talk, all of us." And those words, they sound simple, don't they? But there's a weight to them when you hear them in a certain tone, a heaviness that tells you this isn't just a conversation, this is something else, something bigger, and still, I told myself not to overthink it. I told myself it was probably something small, something ordinary, because that's what I had been doing for so long, minimizing things that didn't feel right, convincing myself everything was fine even when it wasn't, and so I agreed. I said yes, of course I did, because when your children ask to see you, you don't hesitate, you don't question it, you just say yes, hoping that maybe this time things will feel like they used to. Hoping that maybe this is the moment everything comes back together. And as I got ready that day, there was a small part of me, a quiet, almost hopeful part, that thought maybe they missed me, maybe they wanted to spend time together. Maybe this was something good, and that's the part that makes what happened next hurt even more, because hope has a way of making reality feel sharper when it doesn't match what you expected. And when I walked into that room, when I saw all of them sitting there, waiting, quiet, composed, I felt it immediately, that same feeling I had ignored before, that something wasn't right, that this wasn't just a casual family moment, because there was no warmth, no laughter. No ease, just tension, quiet and controlled, like everyone already knew something I didn't. And I remember standing there for a second longer than I should have, looking at their faces, trying to read them, trying to understand what was happening before anyone even spoke. And then one of them gestured for me to sit down, and that small action, it felt different, not like an invitation, but like a step in something already planned. And I sat slowly, carefully, because something inside me was starting to wake up, starting to question, starting to see what I had been avoiding for so long. And then he spoke again, the same calm tone, the same measured words, and he said, "Mom, we've been thinking about what's best for you." And those words, they should have felt comforting, they should have felt like care, but instead they felt heavy, like they carried something I didn't agree to, something I hadn't been part of. And I felt my hands tighten slightly in my lap, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something that was slowly turning into understanding. And I asked quietly, "What do you mean?" Because I needed to hear it. I needed them to say it out loud to make it real. And there was a pause, just a second, just enough to make the moment stretch longer than it should have. And then the words came, simple, direct, but carrying more weight than anything I had heard in a long time. "We think it's time you moved into a care home." And for a moment, everything went still, not the room, not the people, but me, because when something like that hits you, it doesn't always come with immediate emotion. Sometimes it comes with silence, with a kind of stillness that your mind creates while it tries to catch up to what just happened. And I remember blinking once, twice. Like that would somehow change what I heard, like maybe I misunderstood, but I didn't. And as the words settled in, as they became real, I felt something shift inside me, something that had been building for a long time finally finding its shape. Because this wasn't about concern, this wasn't about care, this was a decision, one they had made without me, one they had already agreed on before I even walked into that room, and that realization, it cuts deeper than anything else. Because it tells you exactly where you stand, exactly how you're seen. And I looked at them, one by one, searching for something, for hesitation, for doubt, for someone to say this wasn't final. But there was nothing, just quiet agreement. Just the same controlled expressions, like this was the most reasonable thing in the world. And that's when it hit me fully, not just what they were saying, but what it meant. Because this wasn't just about moving somewhere else. This was about being removed, about being placed somewhere that made their lives easier, about becoming something they didn't have to think about every day. And that realization, it doesn't just hurt, it changes something inside you, because suddenly all those small moments, all those signs you ignored, they come together, they make sense, they form a picture you can't unsee. And I felt my chest tighten, not because I was shocked anymore, but because I finally understood, because this wasn't just distance. This was the end of something I had spent my entire life building, and as I sat there, surrounded by my own children, hearing them decide my future like I wasn't even part of it, I realized something that would stay with me long after that moment ended. I wasn't just being left behind, I was being replaced. And what they said next made it even clearer that this wasn't a suggestion, it was already happening. What if I told you the moment you realize you've been replaced doesn't feel like anger at first, it feels like emptiness, the kind that slowly spreads through you until there's nothing left to hold on to? Because as I sat there listening to them talk about my future like I wasn't even part of it, I wasn't shouting, I wasn't crying, I was just still. Like my mind had stepped back to watch what was happening because it didn't know how to feel it yet. And maybe you felt that too, that strange calm when something hurts too much to process all at once. And I heard their voices, one after another, explaining things, justifying things, using words like safety, comfort, better for you. But none of it felt like it was about me. It felt like it was about them, about making their lives easier, about removing something that had become inconvenient. And that realization, it settled deep because it told me something I hadn't fully accepted until that moment. I wasn't part of their world anymore. I was something they were trying to manage, something they were trying to move out of the way, and I remember looking down at my hands, noticing how still they were, how quiet everything felt inside me, and thinking, is this what I've become? After everything, after all those years, after every sacrifice, after every moment I chose them over myself, this is how it ends. And that question didn't come out loud, it stayed inside, because sometimes the most painful thoughts are the ones you can't even say, not because you don't want to, but because saying them would make them real in a way you're not ready for. And I listened as they talked about places, about facilities, about arrangements they had already looked into, and that's when it became even clearer. This wasn't new, this wasn't something they had just started thinking about, this had been planned. Discussed, decided, all without me, and that's when something inside me shifted again, not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a realization settling into place. Because this wasn't just about where I would live, this was about control, about deciding my life without asking me, about reducing everything I had been to something that could be moved, placed, managed, and I felt a weight in my chest. Not just from the moment, but from everything behind it, from all the years I had believed in something that wasn't true, all the hope I had held on to, all the trust I had given without question. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think something I had avoided for so long, maybe it was never going to come back to me. Maybe all those sacrifices, all those years, they weren't something they carried with them the way I did. Maybe they didn't see it the same way. Maybe they had already moved on from a version of me that I was still holding on to. And that realization, it doesn't just hurt, it changes the way you see everything. Because once you understand that you're not part of someone's priority anymore, you stop expecting them to treat you like you are. And I lifted my head slowly, looking at them again, really looking this time. Not as the children I raised, but as the people they had become, and I saw something I hadn't allowed myself to see before: distance, not just physical, but emotional, a kind of detachment that made this entire situation possible. Because you can't do something like this to someone you're still deeply connected to, you have to separate yourself first, and they had done that slowly, over time, until this moment felt normal to them. Until sitting there and deciding my future without me didn't feel wrong. And that's when the emptiness started to change, slowly, quietly, into something else, something I hadn't felt in a long time: awareness. Because now I wasn't just sitting there trying to understand what was happening. I was starting to see it clearly, starting to recognize what this really was, and that clarity, it doesn't come with comfort, but it comes with strength. Because once you see the truth, once you understand the situation for what it is, you can't go back to pretending. And I realized something then that changed everything about how I felt in that moment. Something that shifted me from being part of their decision to standing outside of it, because this wasn't just happening to me, it was being done without me, and that difference, it matters. Because it means I still had something they couldn't take, my choice, and maybe they didn't realize that yet. Maybe they thought this was already decided. Maybe they believed I would just go along with it the way I had gone along with everything else in my life, putting others first, accepting what was given to me without question. But they forgot something. They forgot that the same strength it took to raise them alone was still there. And as that thought settled in, as that awareness became clearer, I felt something shift again, deeper this time, stronger. Because now I wasn't just reacting to what they were saying, I was beginning to decide what I would do next, and that decision, it didn't come from anger, it didn't come from hurt, it came from something much quieter. Something much more powerful, self-respect, because after everything I had been through, after everything I had given, I realized something I should have known a long time ago. I wasn't something to be moved. I wasn't something to be managed. I was still me, and what I said next was the moment they finally understood that. What if I told you the strongest words you'll ever say aren't loud? They aren't dramatic, they're quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore. Because as I sat there listening to them explain my future like it had already been decided, something inside me finally settled, not in defeat, but in clarity, and maybe you felt that moment too, where everything that once confused you suddenly becomes simple, where all the emotions, all the questions, all the doubts narrow down into one clear truth, and that truth was this. I still had a choice, and they hadn't taken that from me, not yet, and I lifted my head slowly, not rushing, not reacting, but choosing my moment carefully. Because this wasn't about arguing, it wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about taking back something they assumed I had already given up, and I said calmly, clearly, I'm not going, and those 3 words, they didn't echo. They didn't shake the room, but they changed everything, because for the first time since this conversation started, the control shifted, not completely, not instantly, but enough. Enough for them to realize that this wasn't going to be as simple as they thought, and I saw it. That flicker of surprise, that brief moment where their certainty faltered because they hadn't prepared for resistance, they hadn't planned for me to say no. And that's the thing about people who think they've already decided something for you. They don't always know what to do when you step outside of that decision. And one of them spoke quickly, almost too quickly, trying to regain control, trying to bring the conversation back to where they wanted it, saying things like, Mom, you don't understand, and we're just trying to help. But I wasn't listening to the words anymore. I was hearing the intention behind them. And once you hear that clearly, the words lose their power, and I shook my head slightly, not in anger, not in frustration, but in certainty, because I understood now. I understood more than they thought I did, and I said, No, you're trying to make this easier for yourselves, and that sentence, it landed differently because it wasn't emotional, it wasn't defensive, it was true, and truth has a way of cutting through everything else. And for a moment, just a moment, no one spoke, because sometimes the hardest thing to respond to isn't anger, it's honesty. And I could feel the shift growing, that small change in the balance of the situation becoming more real. Because now they weren't just explaining their decision, they were reacting to mine, and that's when I realized something even more important, something that gave me more strength than anything else in that moment. They needed my agreement. Without it, this didn't work the way they planned, and that dependence, it gave me control, not in a loud, obvious way, but in a quiet, steady way that I could use if I stayed calm, if I stayed clear, and I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue because I didn't need to. I had already said what mattered, and instead, I did something they didn't expect. I stood up slowly, deliberately, not in anger, but in finality. Because standing in that moment wasn't just physical, it was a statement. It was me removing myself from something I didn't agree to, and I looked at them, all of them. Not as the children I raised, but as people who had made a decision about my life without me, and I said, You don't get to decide this for me. And those words, they weren't loud, but they were firm, unshakable. And for the first time, I saw something different in their faces. Not certainty, not control, but uncertainty, because the situation had changed, the outcome they expected was no longer guaranteed. And that's when I understood something that stayed with me long after that moment ended. The moment you stand up for yourself is the moment everything changes, not because the situation disappears, not because the people around you suddenly understand, but because you do, because you see your own value clearly enough to protect it, and that changes the way you move, the way you speak, the way you respond. And I didn't stay there to argue, I didn't stay there to convince them, because this wasn't about making them understand. It was about making my decision clear, and I turned calmly, without hesitation, and walked away from that room, leaving behind the conversation they thought they controlled, leaving behind the decision they thought was already made. And as I stepped outside, as I felt the air hit my face, I realized something that I hadn't fully understood until that moment. I wasn't the one being left behind. I was the one choosing to walk away from something that no longer respected me. And that realization, it didn't come with sadness the way I expected. It came with something else, something lighter, something freeing, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for them to choose me. I had chosen myself. And that choice, it changed everything, because what happened after that, what they did next, proved something I had just begun to understand, that sometimes the moment you stop accepting less is the moment people finally reveal who they really are. What if I told you sometimes the ending you fear the most is actually the beginning you need? Because after I walked out of that room, after I said the words they never expected to hear, "I'm not going," I thought the hardest part was over. I thought the decision itself would be the breaking point, but I was wrong. Because the real truth, the real weight of everything, didn't hit me until later, when I was alone, when the silence came back. But this time it felt different, not as heavy, not as suffocating, just honest. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't filling that silence with excuses. I wasn't telling myself things were fine when they weren't. I wasn't holding on to something that had already let go of me. And maybe you felt that kind of clarity before, the kind that doesn't come with comfort right away, but comes with truth. And truth, even when it hurts, has a way of setting you free. And I sat there in my home, the same home I had built, the same walls that had held years of laughter, struggle, sacrifice. And I looked around, really looked this time, not with sadness, but with understanding, because this place wasn't just a house, it was proof of everything I had done. Everything I had survived, everything I had given, and no one had the right to take that away from me, not even the people I loved the most. And that realization, it changed something deep inside me. Because for so long I had measured my worth through them, through how much they needed me, how much they stayed, how much they came back. But in that moment, I saw something clearly for the first time. My worth was never tied to their presence. It was built long before they ever had the choice to leave. And that shift, it's quiet, but it's powerful, because once you stop waiting for others to validate you, you start standing on your own. And standing on your own doesn't mean you don't feel the loss. It doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It just means the pain no longer controls your decisions. And the days that followed weren't easy. I won't pretend they were. Because healing doesn't happen overnight. Understanding doesn't erase years of emotion. And there were moments, quiet ones, where I would think about them, where I would remember the children they used to be, where I would feel that familiar ache in my chest, but it didn't break me the way it used to, because now it was balanced by something stronger: acceptance. And acceptance doesn't mean you agree with what happened. It means you stop fighting reality. You stop trying to rewrite something that's already been decided, and instead, you start writing something new. And that's exactly what I did. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but step by step, decision by decision, choosing myself in ways I never had before, setting boundaries I never thought I could, creating a life that wasn't built around waiting, but around living. And something interesting happens when you do that, when you stop chasing people, when you stop holding on to something that isn't holding on to you. People notice. Not always immediately, not always in the way you expect, but they notice. And it didn't take long before I saw it, the shift in them, the calls that started coming again, the messages that felt different this time, less certain, less controlled, like they were trying to understand something they hadn't expected. And maybe that's the part people don't talk about enough: how quickly dynamics change when you stop accepting what you used to tolerate. Because when you change, everything around you has to adjust. And I didn't rush back into anything. I didn't pretend everything was fine, because it wasn't. And I had finally learned something I wish I had understood years ago: love without respect isn't enough, and respect starts with how you treat yourself, with what you allow, with what you accept. And I chose not to go back to being someone who stayed silent, someone who accepted decisions made without me, someone who placed others above myself at the cost of my own peace. Because I had already done that for years, and I knew where it led. And as time passed, as things slowly settled into a new kind of normal, I realized something that changed the way I saw everything that had happened. Because what I thought was the end wasn't an ending at all. It was a turning point, a moment that forced me to see things clearly, to understand what I deserved, to recognize my own strength in a way I never had before. And maybe that's why I'm telling you this, not because my story is unique, but because the feeling behind it isn't, because there are so many people out there holding onto relationships that no longer value them. So many people waiting to be chosen by those who have already moved on. And if you're one of them, I want you to ask yourself something I wish I had asked sooner. What are you accepting that you don't deserve? Because the moment you answer that honestly is the moment everything begins to change. And I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it won't hurt, but I am saying it's worth it, because at the end of the day, the most important relationship you will ever have is the one you have with yourself. And the moment you start choosing that, truly choosing it, is the moment your life stops being defined by who stays and starts being defined by who you become. And now, at this stage of my life, sitting in the same house that once felt empty but now feels peaceful, I can finally say something I never thought I would. I didn't lose everything when they left me behind. I found myself. And sometimes that's the greatest gift life can give you, even if it comes in a way you never expected. So tell me, if you were in my place, would you have waited for them to come back, or would you have chosen yourself the way I finally did?